All right, today we are going to set up for our chemical weathering lab. So this is going to involve mainly some of these rocks. So this is a type of rock called limestone. When I touch them, they kind of feel really sandy. Like I can feel little tiny bits and pieces of them coming off on my hand. You can kind of see the little bits of stuff stuck together, the little pieces of them. And they're kind of like this light tan color. So that's just their observations here before we get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I have two beakers. One is labeled cold and one is labeled hot. Both of these beakers, we're going to put about 50 grams of our rocks into them. We're going to measure exactly how much, but we're aiming for around 50. We're going to add 100 milliliters of vinegar to each of them. The one that is cold, we're going to keep in a fridge. And the one that is hot, we are going to keep under a heat lamp for about 2 days. And then we'll come back and see if we've had a bit of a difference in how they are weathering. So what we are doing here is a type of chemical weathering because it involves an acid. It's going to involve vinegar. And I just picked this up at Cub, regular old store vinegar. And that is something that will weather our limestone rocks. All right, so now both of our beakers have 100 milliliters of vinegar in them. I'm going to leave those to the side for a second. And now we need to get about 50 grams of rocks for each of ours. So I have my scale and I set it to 0. Now I'm just putting on rocks a couple at a time to try and get close to 50. Take off one of the little rocks. Okay, we'll call that close enough. So this is going to go into our cold beaker. And this is our mass before weathering. We're going to go with 52.42 grams. Okay, so our cold mass before weathering is 52.42 grams. I'm going to go ahead and move those rocks that I just weighed into their beaker. And then we will, again, get another set of about 50 grams. Set that over here. Once again, just grabbing some rocks. It showed 0 before. Like 1 or 2 more rocks. 46, we're almost there. A little one I can take off. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, we're just going to go with that. So that is 53.46 grams. So a little bit heavier than that last one. Oops, and I put that in the wrong box. So that is our hot vinegar before weathering mass. 53.46 grams. All right. So there are 2 masses before weathering. So we have the one with cold in it. The limestone is already in there, and now I'm going to add the limestone we just measured into our hot beaker. And if we start to look, just really before much time has passed, we kind of notice they're already looking a little bit hazy, a little bit dusty. So really not a lot going on. This is a pretty slow reaction, which is why we're going to leave it for about 2 days. I'll kind of see what happens. So like I said, I'm going to go ahead and cover both of these with some tin foil so that the vinegar does not evaporate. Leave the cold one in the fridge and the hot one under a heat lamp. And then we'll come and check back in about 2 days and take their mass again and see where we're at. All right, hello. It has been about 2 days since we mixed up our vinegar with the rocks. So we have our cold beaker, which I just got out of the fridge. Just initially looking, it looks cloudy in there. I did kind of just move it a little bit. Obviously, we still have our rocks. They haven't gone anywhere. We have our hot beaker, which I just got out from underneath the heat lamp. And kind of, from first glance, they look pretty much the same, right? It's kind of cloudy in there. The rocks are still there. The big thing that we'll be looking for is if there's any kind of a change with that mass. So I'm going to go ahead and dump out all of the vinegar, rinse them off and dry them a little bit, and then we'll come back to give them a weigh on our scale, and we'll see where they're at. All right, now we're looking down here at the scale so you can kind of see what I am doing. But I have both our hot and our cold rocks. I've drained all of the vinegar. I've rinsed them off a little bit and kind of put them in some paper towels to dry just a tiny bit. So we are measuring hopefully just the rocks. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on my scale. Make sure it's showing 0 grams. And then I'm going to put just the rocks, not the paper towels here, onto my scale. I think I had a couple more in my paper towels. Yep, no more in the paper towels. Okay, so my rocks are all on my scale. My final mass, so this was our cold beaker of rocks. Mass after weathering for cold. All right, and after weathering, it is reading 52.51 grams. Now you might be going, hey, that doesn't make sense. I thought the mass was supposed to go down. You'd be correct. That is what us teachers think too. But a lot or most of our groups are actually having the same thing happen where after weathering, the cold one actually has a larger mass. There's a couple of reasons this could be, and we're not exactly sure what it is. It could be that the rocks we got were not pure limestone and they're reacting differently with the vinegar and actually creating something else that's like staying attached to the rocks that is increasing the mass. It could be that there's a lot of little tiny holes and things in these rocks, and sitting and soaking in the vinegar for a couple of days, they basically absorbed some of the vinegar like a sponge. That's why the mass went up just a little bit. Or something else. We're not really sure why. So, yes, that is the data we got. Sometimes the answer we get doesn't exactly make sense, but we go with the data that we get. Now, obviously, this is something that's been studied before, so we kind of know that weathering isn't actually usually causing an increase in mass, but that is the data that we got. That is the results we got here for our cold. So the mass did go up to 52.51 grams. Like I said, that's actually not what is supposed to happen in this lab. So the mass is supposed to go down for both cold and hot because what is happening is the vinegar is reacting with the limestone and turning some of the compounds in the limestone into carbon dioxide gas and water, which then are not any more part of the rock. So the mass is supposed to go down. But that is the data we got, so go ahead and record it. And we will move on to measuring the final mass of our hot vinegar rocks. Before you go on to the hot, actually, we're going to look at our rocks here at the end. So they look pretty similar. I will say before we weathered them, they were all very much so the exact same color. And now I see a little bit more variation in the color of some of these. So I wonder if some of them weathered more or less than others. And they also feel very like sandy, like there's stuff kind of coming off on my hand. So they clearly have kind of broken down a bit, feel very sandy. But other than that, that's kind of our observations here after the weathering. So now we will go and look at those rocks that have been in the hot vinegar. All right, we have the hot ones here on our scale. I'm not going to show it to you because you can't read it from there. But it showed the mass for the ones that have been in the hot vinegar are 53.11 grams. We did see a drop in mass here. So there's clearly a difference between them being in cold vinegar versus hot vinegar because the hot behaved more like we expected with the mass dropping. But again, we're not entirely certain what happened with the cold one. But what we should be seeing, what we would expect to be seeing, is that a larger drop in the mass happens in the hot vinegar because that warmth helps to speed up the chemical reaction. So that is our final mass after weathering for the rocks that have been in the hot vinegar. Observations-wise, I'll show it to you here. They look pretty much kind of the same thing as I was mentioning for the ones that were in cold vinegar. Right, again, they kind of feel sandy. There's a little more variation in their color than there was for the first, before we put them in the vinegar, right? So it looks like they might be a little bit different. They're not all purely limestone or something like that. They've weathered a little bit differently. And again, they feel quite sandy. So stuff's like coming off in my hand. So that is pretty much your data. Now, I will say in your table, you will also need to be calculating your change. So you're going to take this mass before weathering and then subtract the mass after weathering. Now, because of our weirdness with the cold one, you're going to have a negative number for cold. That's okay. Hot, you will have a positive number. So go ahead and do that math. Finish up the remainder of the questions, the graph, all of that. And that is it for your chemical weathering lab.